Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2021. Πρόσφατα ξεκίνησα την δημιουργία ενός podcast. Εάν ενδιαφέρεστε για την ιστορία της επιστημονικής φαντασίας, όπως την αντιλαμβάνομαι εγώ, μέσα από την λογοτεχνία, την τηλεόραση και τον κινηματογράφο, μπορείτε να το παρακολουθήσετε. Και στην έρευνα μου που κάνω για τα επεισόδια, έπεσα πάνω σε ένα βιβλίο του 1876, αγγλικό, κάποιου William Godwin, με τον τίτλο Lives of the Necromancers, or an account of the most eminent persons in successive ages who have claimed for themselves or to whom has been imputed by others the exercise of magical power. Και ο κύριος Godwin έχει ένα ολόκληρο κεφάλαιο αφιερωμένο σε πρόσωπα της αρχαίας ελληνικής μυθολογίας και ιστορίας, και έτσι είπα να διαβάσω τουλάχιστον τα συγκεκριμένα αποσπάσματα. Πρέπει να βρω τις σελίδες τώρα, βέβαια. Εδώ είμαστε. Deities of Greece. The gods of the Greeks appear all of them once to have been men. Their real or supposed adventures, therefore, make a part of what is recorded respecting them. Jupiter was born in Crete, and being secreted by his mother in a cave, was suckled by a goat. Being come to man's estate, he warred with the giants, one of whom had 100 hands, and 2 others, brethren, grew 9 inches every month, and when 9 years old, were fully qualified to engage in all exploits of corporeal strength. The war was finished by the giants being overwhelmed with the thunderbolts of heaven and buried under mountains. Minerva was born from the head of her father without a mother, and Bacchus, coming into the world after the death of his female parent, was enclosed in the thigh of Jupiter, and was thus produced at the proper time in full vigour and strength. Minerva had a shield, in which was preserved the real head of Medusa, that had the property of turning every one that looked on it into stone. Bacchus, when a child, was seized on by pirates with the intention to sell him for a slave, but he waved a spear, and the oars of the sailors were turned into vines, which climbed the masts and spread their clusters over the sails. And tigers, lynxes, and panthers appeared to swim around the ship, so terrifying the crew that they leaped overboard and were changed into dolphins. Bacchus, in his maturity, is described as having been the conqueror of India. He did not set out on this expedition like other conquerors at the head of an army. He rode in an open chariot which was drawn by tame lions. His attendants were men and women in great multitudes, eminently accomplished in the arts of rural industry. Wherever he came, he taught men the science of husbandry and the cultivation of the vine. Wherever he came, he was received not with hostility, but with festivity and welcome. On his return, however, Lycurgus, king of Thrace, and Pentheus, king of Thebes, set themselves in opposition to the improvements which the East had received with the most lively gratitude. And Bacchus, to punish them, caused Lycurgus to be torn to pieces by wild horses, and spread a delusion among the family of Pentheus, so that they mistook him for a wild boar which had broken into the vineyards, and of consequence fell upon him, and he expired amidst 1,000 wounds. Apollo was the author of plagues and contagious diseases, at the same time that, when he pleased, he could restore salubrity to a climate, and health and vigour to the sons of men. He was the father of poetry, and possessed in an eminent degree the gift of foretelling future events. Hecate, which was one of the names of Diana, was distinguished as the goddess of magic and enchantments. Venus was the goddess of love, the most irresistible and omnipotent impulse of which the heart of man is susceptible. The wand of Mercury was endowed with such virtues that whoever it touched, if asleep, would start up into life and alacrity, and, if awake, would immediately fall into a profound sleep. When it touched the dying, their souls gently parted from their mortal frame, and when it was applied to the dead returned to life. Neptune had the attribute of raising and appeasing tempests, and Vulcan, the artificer of heaven and earth, not only produced the most exquisite specimens of skill, but also constructed furniture that was endowed with a self-moving principle and would present itself for use or recede at the will of its proprietor. Pluto, in perpetrating the rape of Proserpine, started up in his chariot through a cleft of the earth in the vale of Enna in Sicily, and having seized his prize, disappeared again by the way that he came. Ceres, the mother of Proserpine, in her search after her lost daughter, was received with peculiar hospitality by Celeus, king of Eleusis. She became desirous of remunerating his liberality by some special favour. She saw his only child laid in a cradle and labouring under a fatal distemper. She took him under her protection. She fed him with milk from her own breast, and at night covered him with coals of fire. Under this treatment he not only recovered his strength, but shot up miraculously into manhood, so that what in other men is the effect of years was accomplished in Triptolemus in as many hours. She gave him for a gift the art of agriculture, so that he is said to have been the first to teach mankind to sow and to reap corn and to make bread of the produce. Prometheus, one of the race of the giants, was peculiarly distinguished for his proficiency in the arts. Among other extraordinary productions, he formed a man of clay of such exquisite workmanship as to have wanted nothing but a living soul to cause him to be acknowledged as the paragon of the world. Minerva beheld the performance of Prometheus with approbation and offered him her assistance. She conducted him to heaven, where he watched his opportunity to carry off on the tip of his wand a portion of celestial fire from the chariot of the sun. With this, he animated his image, and the man of Prometheus moved, and thought, and spoke, and became everything that the fondest wishes of his creator could ask. Jupiter ordered Vulcan to make a woman that should surpass this man. All the gods gave her each one a several gift. Venus gave her the power to charm. The Graces bestowed on her symmetry of limb and elegance of motion. Apollo the accomplishments of vocal and instrumental music. Mercury the art of persuasive speech. Juno a multitude of rich and gorgeous ornaments, and Minerva the management of the loom and the needle. Last of all, Jupiter presented her with a sealed box, of which the lid was no sooner unclosed than a multitude of calamities and evils of all imaginable sorts flew out, only hope remaining at the bottom. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus and Pyrrha, his niece. They married. In their time a flood occurred, which, as they imagined, destroyed the whole human race. They were the only survivors. By the direction of an oracle they cast stones over their shoulders, when, by the divine interposition, the stones cast by Deucalion became men, and those cast by Pyrrha women. Thus the earth was repeopled. I have put down a few of these particulars, as containing in several instances the qualities of what is called magic, and thus furnishing examples of some of the earliest occasions upon which supernatural powers have been alleged to mix with human affairs. Demigods. The early history of mortals in Greece is scarcely separated from that of the gods. The first adventurer that it is perhaps proper to notice, as his exploits have I know not what of magic in them, is Perseus, the founder of the metropolis and kingdom of Mycenae. By way of rendering his birth illustrious, he is said to have been the son of Jupiter by Danae, the daughter of Acrisius, king of Argos. The king, being forewarned by an oracle that his daughter should bear a son by whose hand her father should be deprived of life, thought proper to shut her up in a tower of brass. Jupiter, having metamorphosed himself into a shower of gold, found his way into her place of confinement and became the father of Perseus. On the discovery of this circumstance, Acrisius caused both mother and child to be enclosed in a chest and committed to the waves. The chest, however, drifted upon the lands of a person of loyal descent in the island of Seriphos, who extended his care and hospitality to both. When Perseus grew to man's estate, he was commissioned by the king of Seriphos to bring him the head of Medusa, one of the Gorgons. Medusa had the wonderful faculty that whoever met her eyes was immediately turned into stone, and the king, who had conceived a passion for Danae, sent her son on this enterprise with the hope that he would never come back alive. He was, however, favoured by the gods. Mercury gave him wings to fly, Pluto an invisible helmet, and Minerva a mirror shield, by looking in which he could discover how his enemy was disposed without the danger of meeting her eyes. Thus equipped, he accomplished his undertaking, cut off the head of the Gorgon, and pursed it in a bag. From this exploit he proceeded to visit Atlas, king of Mauritania, who refused him hospitality, and in revenge Perseus turned him into stone. He next rescued Andromeda, daughter of the king of Ethiopia, from a monster sent by Neptune to devour her. And lastly, returning to his mother, and finding the king of Seriphos still incredulous and obstinate, he turned him likewise into a stone. The labours of Hercules, the most celebrated of the Greeks of the heroic age, appear to have had little of magic in them, but to have been indebted for their success to a corporeal strength, superior to that of all other mortals, united with an invincible energy of mind which disdained to yield to any obstacle that could be opposed to him. His achievements are characteristic of the rude and barbarous age in which he lived. He strangled serpents and killed the Erymanthian boar, the Nemean lion, and the hydra. Daedalus. Nearly contemporary with the labours of Hercules is the history of Pasiphae and the Minotaur, and this brings us again within the sphere of magic. Pasiphae was the wife of Minos, king of Crete, who conceived an unnatural passion for a beautiful white bull, which Neptune had presented to the king. Having found the means of gratifying her passion, she became the mother of a monster, half man and half bull, called the Minotaur. Minos was desirous of hiding this monster from the observation of mankind, and for this purpose applied to Daedalus, an Athenian, the most skilful artist of his time, who is said to have invented the axe, the wedge, and the plummet, and to have found out the use of glue. He first contrived masts and sails for ships, and carved statues so admirably that they not only looked as if they were alive, but had actually the power of self-motion, and would have escaped from the custody of the possessor if they had not been chained to the wall. Daedalus contrived to Minos a labyrinth, a wonderful structure that covered many acres of ground. The passages in this edifice met and crossed each other with such intricacy that a stranger who had once entered the building would have been starved to death before he could find his way out. In this labyrinth, Minos shut up the Minotaur. Having conceived a deep resentment against the people of Athens, where his only son had been killed in a riot, he imposed upon them an annual tribute of 7 noble youths and as many virgins to be devoured by the Minotaur. Theseus, son of the king of Athens, put an end to this disgrace. He was taught by Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, how to destroy the monster, and furnished with a clue by which afterwards to find his way out of the labyrinth. Daedalus, for some reason, having incurred the displeasure of Minos, was made a prisoner by him in his own labyrinth. But the artist, being never at an end of his inventions, contrived with feathers and wax to make a pair of wings for himself, and escaped. Icarus, his son, who was a prisoner along with him, was provided by his father with similar equipment. But the son, who was inexperienced and heedless, approached too near the sun in his flight, and the wax of his wings being melted with the heat, he fell into the sea and was drowned. The Argonauts. Contemporary with the reign of Minos occurred the expedition of the Argonauts. Jason, the son of the king of Iolcus in Thessaly, was at the head of this expedition. Its object was to fetch the golden fleece, which was hung up in a grove sacred to Mars in the kingdom of Colchis, at the eastern extremity of the Euxine Sea. He enlisted in this enterprise all the most gallant spirits existing in the country, and among the rest Hercules, Theseus, Orpheus, and Amphion. After having passed through a multitude of perils, one of which was occasioned by the Cyanean rocks at the entrance of the Euxine, that had the quality of closing upon every vessel which attempted to make its way between them and crushing it to pieces, a danger that could only be avoided by sending a dove before as their harbinger, they at length arrived. Medea. The golden fleece was defended by bulls, whose hooves were brass and whose breath was fire, and by a never-sleeping dragon that planted itself at the foot of the tree upon which the fleece was suspended. Jason was prepared for his undertaking by Medea, the daughter of the king of the country, herself an accomplished magician, and furnished with philters, drugs, and enchantments. Thus equipped, he tamed the bulls, put a yoke on their necks, and caused them to plough 2 acres of the stiffest land. He killed the dragon, and to complete the adventure drew the monster's teeth, sowed them in the ground, and saw an army of soldiers spring from the seed. The army hastened forward to attack him, but he threw a large stone into the midst of their ranks, when they immediately turned from him, and falling on each other were all killed with their mutual weapons. The adventure being accomplished, Medea set out with Jason on his return to Thessaly. On their arrival they found Aeson, the father of Jason, and Pelias, his uncle, who had usurped the throne, both old and decrepit. Jason applied to Medea and asked her whether among her charms she had none to make an old man young again. She replied she had. She drew the impoverished and watery blood from the body of Aeson. She infused the juice of certain potent herbs into his veins, and he rose from the operation as fresh and vigorous a man as his son. The daughters of Pelias professed a perfect willingness to abdicate the throne of Iolcus, but before they retired they requested Medea to do the same kindness for their father which she had already done for Aeson. She said she would. She told them the method was to cut the old man in pieces and boil him in a kettle with an infusion of certain herbs, and he would come out as smooth and active as a child. The daughters of Pelias had scrupled the operation. Medea, seeing this, begged they would not think she was deceiving them. If, however, they doubted, she desired they would bring her the oldest ram from their flocks, and they should see the experiment. Medea cut up the ram, cast in certain herbs, and the old bellwether came out as beautiful and innocent a he-lamb as was ever beheld. The daughters of Pelias were satisfied. They divided their father in pieces, but he was never restored either to health or life. From Iolcus, upon some insurrection of the people, Medea and Jason fled to Corinth. Here they lived 10 years in much harmony. At the end of that time, Jason grew tired of his wife and fell in love with Glauce, daughter of the king of Corinth. Medea was greatly exasperated by his infidelity, and among other enormities slew with her own hand the 2 children she had borne him before his face. Jason hastened to punish her barbarity, but Medea mounted a chariot drawn by fiery dragons, fled through the air to Athens, and escaped. At Athens she married Aegeus, king of that city. Aegeus, by a former wife, had a son named Theseus, who for some reason had been brought up obscure, unknown, and in exile. At a suitable time he returned home to his father with intention to avow his parentage, but Medea was beforehand with him. She put a poisoned goblet into the hands of Aegeus at an entertainment he gave to Theseus, with the intent that he should deliver it to his son. At the critical moment, Aegeus cast his eyes on the sword of Theseus, which he recognized as that which he had delivered with his son when a child, and had directed that it should be brought by him when a man, as a token of the mystery of his birth. The goblet was cast away. The father and son rushed into each other's arms, and Medea fled from Athens in her chariot drawn by dragons through the air, as she had years before fled from Corinth. Circe. Circe was the sister of Aeetes and Pasiphae, and was, like Medea, her niece, skilful in sorcery. She had besides the gift of immortality. She was exquisitely beautiful, but she employed the charms of her person and the seducing grace of her manners to a bad purpose. She presented to every stranger who landed in her territory an enchanted cup, of which she entreated him to drink. He no sooner tasted it than he was turned into a hog, and was driven by the magician to a sty. The unfortunate stranger retained under this loathsome appearance the consciousness of what he had been, and mourned for ever the criminal compliance by which he was brought to so melancholy a pass. Orpheus. Cicero quotes Aristotle as affirming that there was no such man as Orpheus, but Aristotle is at least single in that opinion, and there are too many circumstances known respecting Orpheus, and which have obtained the consenting voice of all antiquity, to allow us to call in question his existence. He was a native of Thrace, and from that country migrated into Greece. He travelled into Egypt for the purpose of collecting there the information necessary to the accomplishment of his ends. He died a violent death, and, as is almost universally affirmed, fell a sacrifice to the resentment and fury of the women of his native soil. Orpheus was doubtless a poet, though it is not probable that any of his genuine productions have been handed down to us. He was, as all the poets of so remote a period were, extremely accomplished in all the arts of vocal and instrumental music. He civilized the rude inhabitants of Greece and subjected them to order and law. He formed them into communities. He is said by Aristophanes and Horace to have reclaimed the savage man from slaughter and an indulgence in food that was loathsome and foul. And this has with sufficient probability been interpreted to mean that he found the race of men among whom he lived cannibals, and that, to cure them the more completely of this horrible practice, he taught them to be contented to subsist upon the fruits of the earth. Music and poetry are understood to have been made specially instrumental by him to the effecting this purpose. He is said to have made the hungry lion and the famished tiger obedient to his bidding, and to put off their wild and furious natures. This is interpreted by Horace and other recent expositors to mean no more than that he reduced the race of savages, as he found them, to order and civilization. But it was at first, perhaps, understood more literally. We shall not do justice to the traditions of these remote times. We do not, in imagination, transport ourselves among them, and teach ourselves to feel their feelings and conceive their conceptions. Orpheus lived in a time when all was enchantment and prodigy. Gifted and extraordinary persons in those ages believed that they were endowed with marvellous prerogatives, and acted upon that belief. We may occasionally observe, even in these days of the dull and the literal, how great is the ascendancy of the man over the beast when he feels a full and entire confidence in that ascendancy. The eye and the gesture of man cannot fail to produce effects incredibly till they are seen. Magic was the order of the day, and the enthusiasm of its heroes was raised to the highest pitch and attended with no secret misgivings. We are also to consider that in all operations of a magical nature there is a wonderful mixture of frankness and bonhomie, with a strong vein of cunning and craft. Man in every age is full of incongruous and incompatible principles, and when we shall cease to be inconsistent, we shall cease to be men. It is difficult fully to explain what is meant by the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, but in its circumstances it bears a striking resemblance to what has been 1,000 times recorded respecting the calling up of the ghosts of the dead by means of sorcery. The disconsolate husband has, in the first place, recourse to the resistless aid of music. After many preparatives, he appears to have effected his purpose, and prevailed upon the powers of darkness to allow him the presence of his beloved. She appears in the sequel, however, to have been a thin and a fleeting shadow. He is forbidden to cast his eyes on her, and if he had obeyed this injunction, it is uncertain how the experiment would have ended. He proceeds, however, as he is commanded, towards the light of day. He is led to believe that his consort is following his steps. He is beset with a multitude of unearthly phenomena. He advances for some time with confidence. At length, he is assailed with doubts. He has recourse to the auricular sense to know if she is following him. He can hear nothing. Finally, he can endure this uncertainty no longer, and, in defiance of the prohibition he has received, cannot refrain from turning his head to ascertain whether he is baffled and has spent all his labour in vain. He sees her, but no sooner he sees her than she becomes evanescent and impalpable. Farther and farther she retreats before him. She utters a shrill cry and endeavours to articulate, but she grows more and more imperceptible, and in the conclusion he is left with a scene around him in all respects the same as it had been before his incantations. The result of the whole that is known of Orpheus is that he was an eminently great and virtuous man, but was the victim of singular calamity. We have not yet done with the history of Orpheus. As has been said, he fell a sacrifice to the resentment and fury of the women of his native soil. They are affirmed to have torn him limb from limb. His head, divided from his body, floated down the waters of the Hebrus, and miraculously, as it passed along to the sea, it was still heard to exclaim in mournful accents, "Eurydice, Eurydice." At length it was carried ashore on the island of Lesbos. Here, by some extraordinary concurrence of circumstances, it found a resting place in a fissure of a rock overarched by a cave, and, thus domiciliated, is said to have retained the power of speech and to have uttered oracles. Not only the people of Lesbos resorted to it for guidance in difficult questions, but also the Asiatic Greeks from Ionia and Aetolia, and its fame and character for predicting future events even extended to Babylon. Amphion. The story of Amphion is more perplexing than that of the living Orpheus. Both of them turn in a great degree upon the miraculous effects of music. Amphion was of the royal family of Thebes and ultimately became ruler of the territory. He is said, by the potency of his lyre or his skill in the magic art, to have caused the stones to follow him, to arrange themselves in the way he proposed, and without the intervention of a human hand raised a wall about his metropolis. It is certainly less difficult to conceive the savage man to be rendered placable and to conform to the dictates of civilization, or even wild beasts to be made tame, than to imagine stones to obey the voice and the will of a human being. The example, however, is not singular, and hereafter we shall find related that Merlin, the British enchanter, by the power of magic, caused the rocks of Stonehenge, though of such vast dimensions, to be carried through the air from Ireland to the place where we at present find them. Homer mentions that Amphion and his brother Zethus built the walls of Thebes, but does not describe it as having been done by miracle. Tiresias. Tiresias was one of the most celebrated soothsayers of the early ages of Greece. He lived in the times of Oedipus and the War of the Seven Chiefs against Thebes. He was afflicted by the gods with blindness in consequence of some displeasure they conceived against him, but in compensation they endowed him beyond all other mortals with the gift of prophecy. He is said to have understood the language of birds. He possessed the art of divining future events from the various indications that manifest themselves in fire, in smoke, and in other ways, but to have set the highest value upon the communications of the dead, whom by spells and incantations he constrained to appear and answer his inquiries. And he is represented as pouring out tremendous menaces against them when they showed themselves tardy to attend upon his commands. Abaris. Abaris the Scythian, known to us for his visits to Greece, was by all accounts a great magician. Herodotus says that he is reported to have travelled over the world with an arrow, eating nothing during his journey. Other authors relate that this arrow was given to him by Apollo, and that he rode upon it through the air, over lands and seas, and all inaccessible places. The time in which he flourished is very uncertain, some having represented him as having constructed the Palladium, which, as long as it was preserved, kept Troy from being taken by an enemy, and others affirming that he was familiar with Pythagoras, who lived 600 years later, and that he was admitted into his special confidence. He is said to have possessed the faculty of foretelling earthquakes, allaying storms, and driving away pestilence. He gave out predictions wherever he went, and is described as an enchanter, professing to cure diseases by virtue of certain words which he pronounced over those who were afflicted with them. Pythagoras. The name of Pythagoras is one of the most memorable in the records of the human species, and his character is well worthy of the minutest investigation. By this name we are brought at once within the limits of history properly so called. He lived in the time of Cyrus and Darius Hystaspes, of Croesus, of Pisistratus, of Polycrates, tyrant of Samos, and Amasis, king of Egypt. Many hypotheses have been laid down respecting the precise period of his birth and death, but as it is not our purpose to enter into any lengthened discussions of that sort, we will adopt at once the statement that appears to be the most probable, which is that of Lloyd, who fixes his birth about the year before Christ 586, and his death about the year 506. Pythagoras was a man of the most various accomplishments, and appears to have penetrated in different directions into the depths of human knowledge. He sought wisdom in its retreats of fairest promise, in Egypt and other distant countries. In this investigation he employed the earlier period of his life, probably till he was 40, and devoted the remainder to such modes of proceeding as appeared to him the most likely to secure the advantage of what he had acquired to a late posterity. He founded a school and delivered his acquisitions by oral communication to a numerous body of followers. He divided his pupils into two classes. There were neophytes, to whom was explained only the most obvious and general truths, the other who were admitted into the entire confidence of the master. These last he caused to throw their property into a common stock, and to live together in the same place of resort. He appears to have spent the latter half of his life in that part of Italy called Magna Graecia, so denominated in some degree from the numerous colonies of Grecians by whom it was planted, and partly perhaps from the memory of the illustrious things which Pythagoras achieved there. He is said to have spread the seeds of political liberty in Crotona, Sybaris, Metapontum, and Rhegium, and from thence in Sicily to Tauromenium, Catana, Agrigentum, and Himera. Charondas and Zaleucus, themselves famous legislators, derived the rudiments of their political wisdom from the instructions of Pythagoras. But this marvellous man, in some way, whether from the knowledge he received or from his own proper discoveries, has secured to his species benefits of a more permanent nature, and which shall outlive the revolutions of ages and the instability of political institutions. He was a profound geometrician. The two theorems that the internal angles of every right-line triangle are equal to two right angles, and that the square of the hypotenuse of every right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, are ascribed to him. In memory of the latter of these discoveries, he is said to have offered a public sacrifice to the gods, and the theorem is still known by the name of the Pythagorean theorem. He ascertained from the length of the Olympic course, which was understood to have measured 600 of Hercules' feet, the precise stature of that hero. Lastly, Pythagoras is the first person who is known to have taught the spherical figure of the earth, and that we have antipodes. And he propagated the doctrine that the earth is a planet, and that the sun is the centre round which the earth and the other planets move, now known by the name of the Copernican system. To inculcate a pure and a simple mode of subsistence was also an express object of pursuit to Pythagoras. He taught a total abstinence from everything having had the property of animal life. It has been affirmed, as we have seen, that Orpheus before him taught the same thing, but the claim of Orpheus to this distinction is ambiguous. While the theories and dogmas of the Samian age, as he has frequently been styled, were more methodically digested and produced more lasting and unequivocal effects. He taught temperance in all its branches, and a resolute subjection of the appetites of the body to contemplation and the exercises of the mind. And by the unremitted discipline and authority he exerted over his followers, he caused his lessons to be constantly observed. There was therefore an edifying and an exemplary simplicity that prevailed as far as the influence of Pythagoras extended, that won golden opinions to his adherents at all times that they appeared in all places. One revolution that Pythagoras worked was that, whereas immediately before those who were most conspicuous among the Greeks as instructors of mankind in understanding and virtue styled themselves sophists, professors of wisdom, this illustrious man desired to be known only by the appellation of a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. The sophists had previously brought their denomination into discredit and reproach by the arrogance of their pretensions and the imperious way in which they attempted to lay down the law to the world. The modesty of this appellation, however, did not altogether suit with the deep designs of Pythagoras, the ascendancy he resolved to acquire, and the oracular subjection in which he deemed it necessary to hold those who placed themselves under his instruction. This wonderful man set out with making himself a model of the passive and unscrupulous docility which he afterwards required from others. He did not begin to teach till he was 40 years of age, and from 18 to that period he studied in foreign countries with the resolution to submit to all his teachers enjoined, and to make himself master of their least communicated and most secret wisdom. In Egypt, in particular, we are told that though he brought a letter of recommendation from Polycrates, his native sovereign, to Amasis, king of that country, who fully concurred with the views of the writer, the priests, jealous of admitting a foreigner into their secrets, baffled him as long as they could, referring him from one college to another, and prescribing to him the most rigorous preparatives, not excluding the rite of circumcision. But Pythagoras endured and underwent everything, till at length their unwillingness was conquered, and his perseverance received its suitable reward. When in the end Pythagoras thought himself fully qualified for the task he had all along had in view, he was no less strict in prescribing ample preliminaries to his own scholars. At the time that the pupil was proposed to him, the master, we are told, examined him with multiplied questions as to his principles, his habits and intentions, observed minutely his voice and manner of speaking, his walk and his gestures, the lines of his countenance, and the expression and management of his eye, and when he was satisfied with these, then and not till then admitted him as a probationer. It is to be supposed that all this must have been personal. As soon, however, as this was over, the master was withdrawn from the sight of the pupil, and a novitiate of 3 and 5 in all 8 years was prescribed to the scholar, during which time he was only to hear his instructor from behind a curtain, and the strictest silence was enjoined him through the whole period. As the instructions Pythagoras received in Egypt and the East admitted of no dispute, so in his turn he required an unreserved submission from those who heard him. Αυτός έφη, the master has said it, was deemed a sufficient solution to all doubt and uncertainty. To give the greatest authority and effect to his communications, Pythagoras hid himself during the day at least from the great body of his pupils, and was only seen by them at night. Indeed, there is no reason to suppose that anyone was admitted into his entire familiarity. When he came forth, he appeared in a long garment of the purest white, with a flowing beard and a garland upon his head. He is said to have been of the finest symmetrical form, with a majestic carriage and a grave and awful countenance. He suffered his followers to believe that he was one of the gods, the Hyperborean Apollo, and is said to have told Abaris that he assumed the human form, that he might the better invite men to an easiness of approach and to confidence in him. What, however, seems to be agreed in by all his biographers is that he professed to have already in different ages appeared in the likeness of man, first as L.Ä, the son of Mercury, and when his father expressed himself ready to invest him with any gift short of immortality, he prayed that, as the human soul is destined successively to dwell in various forms, he might have the privilege in each to remember his former state of being, which was granted him. From L.Ä he became Ophivus, who slew Patroclus at the siege of Troy. He then appeared as Hermotimus, then Pyrrhus, a fisherman of Delos, and finally Pythagoras. He said that a period of time was interposed between each transmigration, during which he visited the seat of departed souls, and he professed to relate a part of the wonders he had seen. He is said to have eaten sparingly and in secret, and in all respects to have given himself out for a being not subject to the ordinary laws of nature. Pythagoras therefore pretended to miraculous endowments. Happening to be on the seashore when certain fishermen drew to land an enormous multitude of fishes, he desired them to allow him to dispose of the capture, which they consented to, provided he would name the precise number they had caught. He did so, and required they should throw their prize into the sea again, at the same time paying them the value of the fish. He tamed a Daunian bear by whispering in his ear, and prevailed on him henceforth to refrain from the flesh of animals, and to feed on vegetables. By the same means, he induced an ox not to eat beans, which was a diet specially prohibited by Pythagoras. And he called down an eagle from his flight, causing him to sit on his hand and submit to be stroked down by the philosopher. In Greece, when he passed the river Nessus to Macedon, the stream that was heard to salute him with the words, "Hail Pythagoras." When Abaris addressed him as one of the heavenly host, he took the stranger aside and convinced him that he was under no mistake by exhibiting to him his thigh of gold, or, according to another account, he used the same sort of evidence at a certain time to satisfy his pupils of his celestial descent. He is said to have been seen on the same day at Metapontum in Italy and at Tauromenium in Sicily, though these places are divided by the sea, so that it was conceived that it would cost several days to pass from one to the other. In one instance, he absented himself from his associates in Italy for a whole year, and when he appeared again, related that he had passed that time in the infernal regions, describing likewise the marvellous things he had seen. Diogenes Laertius, speaking of this circumstance, affirms, however, that he remained during this period in a cave, where his mother conveyed him intelligence and necessaries, and that when he came in once more into light and air, he appeared so emaciated and colourless that he might well be believed to have come out of Hades. The close of the life of Pythagoras was, according to every statement, in the midst of misfortune and violence. Some particulars are related by Iamblichus, which, though he is not an authority beyond all exception, are so characteristic as seem to entitle them to the being transcribed. This author is more circumstantial than any other in stating the elaborate steps by which the pupils of Pythagoras came to be finally admitted into the full confidence of the master. He says that they passed 3 years in the first place in a state of probation, carefully watched by their seniors, and exposed to their occasional taunts and ironies by way of experiment to ascertain whether they were of a temper sufficiently philosophical and firm. At the expiration of that period, they were admitted to a novitiate in which they were bound to uninterrupted silence, and heard the lectures of the master while he was himself concealed from their view by a curtain. They were then received to initiation and required to deliver over the property to the common stock. They were admitted to intercourse with the master. They were invited to a participation of the most obscure theories and the abstrusest problems. If, however, in this stage of their progress they were discovered to be too weak of intellectual penetration, or any other fundamental objection were established against them, they were expelled the community. The double of the property they had contributed to the common stock was paid down to them. A headstone and a monument inscribed with their names was set up in the place of meeting of the community. They were considered as dead, and if afterwards they met by chance any of those who were of the privileged few, they were treated by them as entirely strangers. Cylon, the richest man, or as he is in one place styled, the Prince of Crotona, had manifested the greatest partiality to Pythagoras. He was at the same time a man of rude, impatient, and boisterous character. He, together with Perialus of Thurium, submitted to all the severities of the Pythagorean school. They passed the 3 years of probation and the 5 years of silence. They were received into the familiarity of the master. They were then initiated and delivered all their wealth into the common stock. They were, however, ultimately pronounced deficient in intellectual power, or for some other reason were not judged worthy to continue among the confidential pupils of Pythagoras. They were expelled. The double of the property that they had contributed was paid back to them. A monument was set up in memory of what they had been, and they were pronounced dead to the school. It will easily be conceived in what temper silence sustained this degradation. Of Perialus we hear nothing further, but Cylon, from feelings of the deepest reverence and awe for Pythagoras, which he had cherished for years, was filled even to bursting with inextinguishable hatred and revenge. The unparalleled merits, the venerable age of the master whom he had so long followed, had no power to control his violence. His paramount influence in the city ensured him the command of a great body of followers. He excited them to a frame of turbulence and riot. He represented to them how intolerable was the despotism of the pretended philosopher. They surrounded the school in which the pupils were accustomed to assemble and set it on fire. 40 persons perished in the flames. According to some accounts, Pythagoras was absent at the time. According to others, he and 2 of his pupils escaped. He retired from Crotona to Metapontum, but the hostility which had broken out in the former city followed him there. He took refuge in the Temple of the Muses, but he was held so closely besieged that no provisions could be conveyed to him, and he finally perished with hunger after, according to L.Ә, 40 days' abstinence. It is difficult to imagine anything more instructive and more pregnant with matter for salutary reflection than the contrast presented to us by the character and system of action of Pythagoras on the one hand, and those of the great inquirers of the last 2 centuries, for example, Bacon, Newton, and Locke, on the other. Pythagoras probably does not yield to any one of these in the evidences of true intellectual greatness. In his school, in the followers he trained resembling himself, and in the salutary effects he produced on the institutions of the various republics of Magna Graecia and Sicily, he must be allowed greatly to have excelled them. His discoveries of various propositions in geometry, of the earth as a planet, and of the solar system as now universally recognized, clearly stamp him a genius of the highest order. Yet this man, thus enlightened and philanthropical, established his system of proceeding upon narrow and exclusive principles, and conducted it by methods of artifice, quackery, and delusion. One of his leading maxims was that the great and fundamental truths to the establishment of which he devoted himself were studiously to be concealed from the vulgar, and only to be imparted to a select few, and after years of the severest novitiate and trial. He learned his earliest lessons of wisdom in Egypt after this method, and he conformed through life to the example which had thus been delivered to him. The severe examination that he made of the candidates previously to their being admitted into his school, and the years of silence that were then prescribed to them, testify this. He instructed them by symbols, obscure and enigmatical propositions, which they were first to exercise their ingenuity to expound. The authority and dogmatical assertions of the master were to remain unquestioned, and the pupils were to fashion themselves to obsequious and implicit submission and were the furthest in the world from being encouraged to the independent exercise of their own understandings, there was nothing that Pythagoras was more fixed to discountenance than the communication of the truths upon which he placed the highest value to the uninitiated. It is not probable, therefore, that he wrote anything. All was communicated orally, by such gradations, and with such discretion as he might think fit to adopt and to exercise. Delusion and falsehood were main features of his instruction. With what respect, therefore, can we consider, and what manliness worthy of his high character and endowments can we impute to his discourses delivered from behind a curtain, his hiding himself during the day, and only appearing by night in a garb assumed for the purpose of exciting awe and veneration? What shall we say to the story of his various transmigrations? At first sight, it appears in the light of the most audacious and unblushing imposition. And if we were to yield so far as to admit that by a high-wrought enthusiasm, by a long train of maceration and visionary reveries, he succeeded in imposing on himself, this, though in a different way, would scarcely less detract from the high stage of eminence upon which the nobler parts of his character would induce us to place him. Such were some of the main causes that have made his efforts perishable, and the last of which should have attended his genius in a great degree transitory and fugitive. He was probably much under the influence of a contemptible jealousy, and must be considered as desirous that none of his contemporaries or followers should eclipse their master. All was oracular and dogmatic in the school of Pythagoras. He prized, and justly prized, the greatness of his attainments and discoveries, and had no conception that anything could go beyond them. He did not encourage, nay, he resolutely opposed all true independence of mind, and that undaunted spirit of enterprise which is the atmosphere in which the sublimest thoughts are the most naturally generated. He therefore did not throw open the gates of science and wisdom and invite every comer, but on the contrary, narrowed the entrance and carefully reduced the number of aspirants. He thought not of the most likely methods to give strength and permanence and an extensive sphere to the progress of the human mind. For these reasons he wrote nothing, but consigned all to the frail and uncertain custody of tradition, and distant posterity has amply avenged itself upon the narrowness of his policy, and the name of Pythagoras, which would otherwise have been ranked with the first luminaries of mankind and consigned to everlasting gratitude, has, in consequence of a few radical and fatal mistakes, been often loaded with obloquy, and the hero who bore it been indiscriminately classed among the votaries of imposture and artifice. Calo bravo.